So this is not by any I promise you that, and this is what we family. Everyone in the group will come together. Which is yes, as a strongest society. Some of us put it together at the stage. Hence, we are doing this. Before I can start ceremony, start with the will introduce someone everybody else. I want to mention that on behalf of my time, it's 22,896,000 rand. So what we gave you for a period of 3 months is what we call S. Multiplied by 477 is 22 million rand. There is a deep per person, and you don't know the way to teach programming. You just teach you the same tags and you don't get to solve your problems. Here you go. Now you have projects. I have what I have first. If you're on the job right now, you're ready for that. Really get higher. 70,000 rand. All right, that's one. If you finish a degree and you want more, you can go for data science. Python is very good in this area.
I asked the CFO, what is the representation in rands and cents of that declining subsidy? And he mentioned the amount. And we said, well, as Wits University at the time we were at Wits, then we should think of ways of how we push back against the defunding of this sector. And you paused the meeting as chair and you said, Vice Chancellor, I've been chairing such meetings for a long time, and never have I seen such a constructive conversation between student representatives and the university in trying to understand the challenges that the sector is facing, as opposed to matrix building, this is the 11th floor. So that my recollection took me to that meeting, and it's very much relevant in my view to today. And so I jotted down a couple of notes in preparation for this particular gathering, because for me, it's consistent with a vision I've always subscribed to for a very long time. So I came to Johannesburg 16 years ago to study here. And I could hardly string a sentence, let alone code. A sentence in English, that is. And I barely survived my undergraduate. But because of well-meaning intervention, pedagogic interventions, such as this one, I went from the worst undergraduate student in my first year to the best undergraduate final year in the same faculty. I graduated, I was on top of my class, and a professor whose name is quite difficult to pronounce, Buchendorn, we now lecture in the same faculty of science here at UJ, said, look, we are moving to UJ, and we got into his dusty car and we came over this side, and I came to do my master's here at UJ. So I'm a UJ alumni as well, and so I'm no guest, no visitor, and I found it natural that I reflect on that particular experience. So I say that to say this then. After studying and lecturing in 4 different universities across 4 continents, I can confirm that something special is happening at the JBS. I can confirm that something special is happening at the JBS. So I've studied and worked in Asia, Africa obviously being my area of birth, Europe, and a bit of North America, specifically Canada. And usually it's standard. There is a standard approach to teaching and learning, and there's a standard approach to the role universities play. Universities are somewhere there in the island, and the rest of society commutes on a daily basis, both mentally and physically, to go be part of that privilege and then return home. Never have I seen then a university literally taking itself into society and changing society in the process. So that is my understanding of this initiative, is that you're almost redefining what universities are conceived as, far from what would have been an ivory tower into people's driven universities. And I was particularly reminded of that when you mentioned the SDGs. Now, our knowledge of the world, Professor Oman said, is often fragmentary, incomplete, and sometimes wrong. Our knowledge of the world is often fragmentary, incomplete, and sometimes wrong, which means we need skilled analysts and researchers to discern the truth and get us to the closest possible picture to what the future will mostly look like, which means the creation of the future. Professor Clark says all history is a current event. The past not only informs the present, but the present is simultaneously giving birth to the likelihood of future events. Now, if you are taking a humanities student to do the kind of things that we witness outside, I can assure you now, as a person who studied higher education policy, you are rewriting the script of teaching and learning. Yes. I'm also part of the Sachi Chair Teaching and Learning, which is with Professor Mutala just above where we are now. And we research in many ways the evolution of teaching and learning and the meaning of what it means to be in the classroom, let alone who gets to be in the classroom. Of course, you would know, being in South Africa, you are part of an absolute minority. So the weight on your shoulders is not the same as the one of a British or a Canadian or an American student. You carry centuries of reparation that we talk, repairing as a way of preparing a different future. I was hearing, because you are also a walking library of the history of universities, Rudy. You mentioned why, for example, technical Witwatersrand was established. And this is what JBS is doing. Basically, there was a mining boom, and so you needed the best available miners to deal with that situation and make the most of those opportunities. The role that the JBS is playing now is best described on a number of documents, but one that particularly appealed to me is that JBS is likely to reduce ignorance, reduce uncertainty, and improve the quality of decision making. Now, whatever happens in future is informed by the quality of the decision making. But the decision making is informed by what goes into the process or the conversation and who gets to talk. In this case now, you have a historian. I'm going to touch now on some of the exhibitions that I saw outside there. I saw humanities people. There was one called Road to Million. That one I thought it was about money. So I went straight there. Said Road to Million. So I went there and realized, no. It's actually an investment analysis on what would likely happen if you put in 100 rand over a particular period of time. And I thought that was incredible. Then I saw an ad that should be rushed to primary, rather to high schools across the country immediately, where you put in UJ and it tells you everything about UJ. And with a bit further development, you put in JBS, it will tell you everything about JBS. So you don't necessarily have to visit UJ to know everything you need to know about UJ before you come here, which, by the way, may address one tragedy that once occurred when somebody's mother suffered a serious injuries in a stampede when people were queuing during late registration. UJ subsequently dealt with that tragedy by introducing something called UJ.mobi. What I saw outside by humanities undergraduate students was building on one of the most revolutionary interventions technologically by the university. And I thought that deserved a round of applause. Now, how we choose to theorize or think about higher education is inextricably linked to what we think education is for and for whom we think it is for. Whatever choice we take, whatever route we take, our choices will always transcend the walls of the university. And this denotes that we take greater care and responsibility in the views we advocate, the values we promote, and the pathways that we adopt to try and get where we claim we're going to get to. So when you think of education after you've been at the JBS, I think the biggest theoretical contribution, Professor Carlson, will be that if you go into JBS, well, prior to you going in, somebody asks you, so what is a university? You give a description. You go into JBS, you come out, they ask you, what is a university? You give a totally different answer after you've experienced that. Now, for me, as a scholar of education, that's fundamental because universities will have to sustain their appeal, their soft power, their relevance. You can see what AI is doing to just teaching and learning alone. Then think about what AI could do to the funding crisis of universities. Perhaps blended learning. Perhaps we can take a JBS to every town, every capital on the continent without duplicating anything or any human power for that matter. So the kind of innovations that are happening here from where I'm sitting as an educator are not only linked to the sustainability of the sector as a whole, but will put UJ in the cutting edge of higher education innovation. That's my observation. Now, my second last point is that 76 years ago, one Truman, at the tail end of the Second World War, which I'm sure many of you were around. I meant Rudy, not you guys. Only fossils would have been around. But Truman at the time, I don't have to subscribe to everything Truman said or did, Prof. I just want to take this part on the GI Bill, which they were trying to educate soldiers coming from war. And so they introduced something called the GI Bill. But I picked something in the preamble of that GI Bill which said if the ladder of educational opportunity raises high at the doors of some youth and scarcely rises at the doors of others, whilst education is being made a prerequisite for any form of social or occupational advance, then education may become the means not of redressing the past injustices, but of reproducing them. And so they went on to educate all the military veterans. So when you are watching a movie and you see a neat highway in the United States, just know that a military veteran built that. If you see all forms of infrastructure in North America, one way or the other can be traced to military veterans who were trained through the GI Bill, but the GI Bill was done on the back of the thinking I've just quoted now. And I'm saying, therefore, if you give education the role that you give it in South Africa, which is to redress thousands of years, not just the 300 years that we're talking about, thousands of years of underdevelopment and injustice, then you better invest in it appropriately. You cannot possibly give these soldiers a responsibility to go to war and then give them a stick to go conquer the world. You ought to arm them intellectually, that is appropriate. So this then, Professor G, is the arming of that future generation. So now, if you give me a platform and you don't put a timer, you may actually regret that. And so I'm self-policing now, Professor Randall, and the focus on grit is particularly central to what I like to call the fundamentals of nation formation and nation management. If you want to understand an inventory of all the things that need to go into the pot for a nation to be formed, grit can't be outside of it. Because grit, in my elementary understanding, is the ability to remain steadfast in the toughest of times. And so all nations are in some form of a competition, which means you need the kind of human capital that will not fold at the sight of the slightest wind or collapse at the sight of the slightest mistake you would have made. You make up that mistake, you get up, you run. You fall, you get up, and you run. Now, that definition that Professor Randall was referring to, the nature of a classroom, that I'm pleased that you are not having to experience it, where you know of 200 guys, only 3 will survive. Suddenly, I then theorized what you're doing here, Professor Randall, as something I liked to call on my doctoral thesis an airport ATM. Now, different social, cultural, and economic forms of, and usually those portfolios of capital to bring to the United uneven depending where you were born. Old theory, the difference is often punitive. Those you don't have the pressure like the of your for going the scientific route. The opposite of that theory in teaching, in which you are instructing, says we are not so what you lack. Suddenly, if you go to Heathrow or any airport for that matter, and you are lost, there's one thing called an airport ATM, which when you put your card, whether it's Barclays, whether it's Itala, or I almost said VBS. Sorry. I was trying to check the disparity between the banking institutions, and then I landed on that one. So you take a card from Mumbai, from Jakarta, from the United States, or from China, and you put it in it recognizes the exact value you have in that currency and translate it into the local environment. The airport ATM recognizes that everybody brings something. Something. You bring something. And so it does what you would call capital conversion. Now, if I take 10 pounds and go to my village in Venda and I go to a spaza shop and I want to buy, they'll say, I ring, or it doesn't buy here. Something is happening there. The 10 pound note, the last time I checked, is times 23. But it turns out, and I argue in my thesis, what we should be doing to translate our universities